All right, so I would like to go over the action potential right now. And let me adjust my camera a little bit. All right, so you can see here I have the basic diagram of an action potential drawn out. I have a lot of lines going through here, but first and foremost, I just want to talk about what we're actually measuring here. So what this axis is on over here is voltage. So we have right here where this line is straight and straight over here. Adjust it again. Straight here and straight here. We call this our resting membrane potential. Now for a lot of cells, this could sit at something like negative 55 millivolts. And then our chart might go up to something like 80 positive millivolts, and maybe let's just say this is negative 80 millivolts. Regardless, the point being is we have a varying scale that is measured in millivolts. And then as you can see, we start with our action potential at what we call the resting phase, this part right here. And then we go into an excited phase. Voltage spikes, and this is where the transmission down the neuron actually occurs. And then the signal stops and it neutralizes out. It actually overcorrects, and then it comes back to a nice flat line right there. To actually discuss what's happening here, let's break this up into its phases. So, right here, we have a better marker. All right. So this section up here, where the voltage is not changing, we call that resting phase. And then here, right until we hit, see how our green line comes across here. So from when we start increasing to where we hit this equilibrium point, or we pass our resting membrane potential, we call this the absolute refractory period. And then past that, right until we get back to resting membrane, we call this the relative refractory period. Okay, make sure it's still recording. All right, so what happened? The resting phase is exactly what it sounds like. Nothing is happening. We're sitting completely still. Absolute refractory period, where this being what we call the action potential is occurring, and there's no shot any other action potential is going to occur. Then when we get to the relative refractory period, there is a chance that we could, again, depolarize the membrane, but until we get back to resting membrane potential back over here, it's going to take a pretty heavy stimulus to do so. I want to talk about ions that are actually moving through each period and what's causing this sense of depolarization to occur. So, noting that we have a purple line of threshold right here, and then we have a resting membrane potential in green. In the resting phase, all of our channels, so all channels closed, meaning we don't have any ion channels that are open. The only permeable, well, I shouldn't say any. We technically have our potassium leach channels open, which is helping us establish this membrane, but all voltage-gated ion channels are closed. No stimulus has occurred. Awesome, stimulus now occurs. So we have something that allows us to begin to excite our cell until we hit this purple line called threshold. Threshold being the minimum voltage we have to hit, or I guess maximum voltage, because we're going from negative to positive. Maximum voltage we can hit until we have to activate action potential. In this series right here, or in this, until we hit this orange line at the peak of our action potential, what's happening here is our Na plus channels are open. At the peak, since now that we've had all our positive come into our cell, we need to actually equilibrate our cell, and what's going to happen is as we fall down, and this includes from the absolute refractory period all the way to the end of the relative, or all the way to, I guess we should have another line right there, all the way to the very low point of hyperpolarization are K plus channels open. That's allowing potassium to flow back into, or back out of the cell. Oh, no, sorry. Sodium flowed in, potassium flowing out. And then that'll be reestablished later on via our ATP ACEs and our potassium leak channels till we get back to resting membrane potential. And once we get to this point right here, again, all channels now closed, or rather voltage gated channels are now closed, and only the potassium leak channels are open, and that's going to reestablish the electrochemical gradient, and we're going to get back to. All right, I did want to add one note about when we say these channels are open and closed, what that actually looks like. It looks like on the mechanism side. So, turn this over here. Let's start with our sodium channels. So our sodium channels look something a little like this. And then, let's say, I don't know, you have a plug. That's not super accurate, but it works. Okay. So let's write some terminology on here. So this right here is called the activation gate. And this is called the inactivation gate. And then this, if I were to add some membrane here, this is the ECF, and this is the ICF. When we hit threshold during the rising phase, when we hit the rising phase, we are going to transition to something, or our voltage-gated sodium channel is going to look like this. Wish I could copy and paste, but our whiteboards haven't gotten to that advancement yet. And look at that. We hit threshold, and during the rising phase, now our sodium ions can flow through. But this, despite it being written on the board here permanently, this is a very fleeting stage, because very quickly, as soon as that activation gate opens, and we only have like really a couple ions flow through, that inactivation gate is going to swing around and close it up, so we don't have any more passage of sodium coming through the channel. This is going to remain in this conformation until we get below resting membrane potential over here. Once it gets to below resting membrane potential, it's actually going to reset the gate. But before that even occurs, we have our potassium voltage gated channels. So I'm going to erase some of this, but not all of it. Still have good concepts. So potassium channels have a very similar dealio here, where they also have a gate. Oh, sorry. They also have a gate right here. And when it hits threshold, or rather, I guess their appropriate voltage is super, super positive, whereas sodium's voltage was very, very negative. When we hit the proper voltage, that gate's going to swing open, and same deal. Potassium ions can flow through. And once we hit the appropriate voltage, which will be that hyperpolarization point, that will cause that gate to swing shut. Something like that. That was a terrible drawing, but you get the idea. That'll cause that to shut, and then through our potassium leak channels is when everything will go to. All right. So now we are going to talk about what happens once the ion has finally made the journey inside the membrane. It's so exciting. So let's take the sodium ion, for example. He gets in there, and let's just say you got tapped on the, that's not even accurate. Let's say you had a feather. That'd be a good example. A feather brush up against your skin, and you may or may not feel it. this is going to be the determining factor. So when that feather brushes your skin, let's say you have some of your sensory receptors that some of those fields are going to, or some of your, sorry, got lost in my mind. So some of your sodium voltage-gated ions, voltage-gated channels are going to open, and they're going to let some sodium through. And when that happens, this sodium is going to enter, and he's going to have what we can call two things. We can call a Bourne, or sphere of influence is a fancier way of saying it, but let's call it a Bourne because that's funner. So a Bourne is sort of what this guy's electromagnetic field effect is on the stuff, or on everything around it. So the Bourne is influenced by a couple of things. The strength of it is going to be, first of all, it's going to be, it takes into account how hard it is for this ion to leave the cell. So we call this membrane resistance, and the higher the membrane the resistance is, the harder it is for the ion to leave the cell. So that means it's going, his Bourne, or his influence around everything, or every influence inside the cell, is going to be stronger because the odds of him sticking around are pretty high. So we'll say this: high Rm will give a stronger Bourne because they stick around for longer. Something else we like to consider is what else is inside our environment. So if, for example, you can see these little orange guys, they have negatives. This is a chloride ion. These are just some, I drew scribbles, but they're actually proteins because you get negatively charged proteins. So as you get some negatively charged proteins in here, or really anything that's opposing charge to what you're considering having a sphere of influence, so this could be a chloride ion, this could be positive stuff, but usually we're talking about positive things. As you have opposing charges in here, that's going to absorb some of that effect that the ion's having, meaning that its sphere of influence can't reach as far as you'd like it to. That's unfortunate, but we do call this concept Ri, or internal resistance. The higher the Ri, the weaker the Bourne. So let's take this for example. With these negatively charged ions in here, my Bourne is going to go out, and the whole point of having a Bourne is to actually propagate another ion gate to open, meaning we're increasing its negative characteristic to become more positive, hopefully hitting that threshold point. If the internal resistance is too high, or the influence of the membrane to keep the ion end is too low, that its Bourne will not make it there. But let's say I took some of these out. All of a sudden, my influence is so much stronger, and I'm actually going to allow another sodium ion to come in, because my activation gate's going to pop open, then my activation gate, and we're going to get a propagation down my neuron, and that's actually that would be the determining factor whether or not you felt the feather brush up against your skin. If you did, that means it was strong enough to cause an action potential, a series of action potentials. In the case that we have a failed ion, or only a couple ions come through and they don't propagate an action potential, we call that a graded potential. In the past, we talked about EPSPs and IPSPs. EPSPs are they give a stronger Bourne. They allow for a scenario where we're getting more excitation. IPSP is the exact opposite. So the feather brushing up against your skin, EPSP. Hopefully hopefully it's strong enough to propagate a action potential. I want to talk a little bit more about capacitance in terms of ion movement. So I have a neuron drawn here, and I have two sides to this thing. The first side is this myelinated region, and then this other side is an unmyelinated region. So you can see here that we have 3 positive charges on the myelinated region, positive, negative, versus, oh, sorry, I have these flipped, my bad. Positive, actually, that's right, that should be negative, it should be negative, that should be positive. All right, try again. So in our region here, we have 3 negatives and 3 positives, and then 5 negatives and 5 positives. So this idea of how close the charges are together to maintain our resting membrane potential is called capacitance. So either side of these are going to maintain a resting membrane potential of, I don't know, let's say negative 55 millivolts. 55 millivolts. Oops. Either one, even though this one has more charge, and the reason for that gets a little bit complicated, but it has to do with the fact of how close these ions are together. They sort of absorb each other's effect, versus this guy right here, the ions aren't as close to each other, so there's more room for those fields to do other things. And that's where we come in before I move on from that, these two equations exemplify what's going on here. So capacitance, C, is equal to our charge divided by our voltage. And this isn't so much an equation for math as much it is an equation for a relationship, in my opinion. That just is literally defining, hey, what is capacitance? The math equation really comes from right here, where epsilon is a conductance constant, I believe. A is area, and D is the length, the length of the path, the distance. T stands for distance, but really it's the thickness of the membrane. So what this is telling us is that as we increase area or decrease the membrane, we get a higher capacitance. And you can see that here. Right here we have a really thin membrane, so our D is really, really small, and our area is larger. So that means we have a very high capacitance. We have more, going back to a relationship, we have more charges per volt, because again, both are negative 55. But on this equation, we have a very large distance in a smaller area, so we have a very small capacitance. In terms of getting a Boulogne to occur, this myelinated region is actually a lot better because of the small capacitance, our ion is actually less likely to flow out of our membrane here. That relationship is actually further defined by something we call the time constant. So the time constant is what it actually is telling us how long does it take for this ion to travel through the membrane. A really, really thin membrane, easy peasy. A really, really thick membrane, hard. Again, going back to capacitance, if we have a high capacitance membrane, it's actually a lot easier to go through. Wait, let me see that. Nope. High capacitance membrane makes it more difficult to go through because of the condensed charge, versus low capacitance is much easier to go through. So this equation writes out to Rm, which is our membrane resistance, which is proportional to the distance of our membrane. And we actually multiply that by our capacitance, or we call it membrane capacitance. So as you can see, as we increase membrane resistance, it's harder to travel through. Time constant is literally the time it takes for it to travel. So as we increase membrane resistance, which we're doing in this scenario, as we make our membrane thicker, it's harder for the ion to pass through. As you increase capacitance, again, it's harder for the ion to go through. Increasing capacitance here. Ultimately, the math works out to where having myelinated neurons is a lot better than unmyelinated neurons because of the huge increase in Rm we experience when we have myelinated regions, which makes a very large time constant, which is essentially just saying, hey, it's a lot easier to keep our ion inside the cell versus it diffusing out, which means we get a better Boulogne, which means we get a better excitation, and well, I have a lot of time constants going on right now because I'm talking a lot. Our length constant, on the other hand, is talking about the Boulogne itself. How much oomph does this Boulogne have? There are some factors that go into it that we actually talked about earlier, so it should look familiar. We have the actual equation is I think it's the square root of Rm divided by Ri. So ultimately, this is saying that as we increase Rm, our length constant is going to increase, or our Boulogne is going to be stronger, which again makes sense. We're influencing our ion to stay in for longer. Similar idea to time constant. And as we increase Ri, which was the negatively charged things or whatever else may be going on inside our membrane or inside our cell that's sucking up that Boulogne, as we increase Ri, our Boulogne is going to be weaker. Awesome. For this last bit, we are going to be talking about the actual synapse of how, or say we have a strong enough bond, we propagate through, how is that signal actually passed from neuron to neuron? So on one side, we have the presynaptic neuron, and the other side, we have the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so under the circumstance, our cell has been excited, meaning we have, let's fix this a little bit. We have Na plus, or some other sort, it's actually going to be Na plus. So we have Na plus and it's in here, right? And it has a strong bond, we know that because of what's happened. And then it's going to hit a channel that's going to allow calcium to come through. So it comes through. Now calcium is actually going to go find something called a snare protein. And these snare proteins, these snare proteins are attached to vesicles that contain neurotransmitters. So NT stands for neurotransmitter. And when the calcium gets to the snare protein, it looks something like this. So this is this internal membrane I'm going to be drawing right here, and it comes down, comes like that, and let's say this part's the snare, and our neurotransmitter is here in the middle. So when calcium comes, it's going to attack that. And that's actually going to cause these, these sides to twist, and our neurotransmitter is going to fuse with the external membrane of our presynaptic neuron. So that neurotransmitter is going to go out, and now we'll have the neurotransmitter in what we call, this is the synaptic cleft, which is just to say empty space, not empty, but empty space between the presynaptic and postsynaptic, where neurotransmitters are sent. Neurotransmitter is going to go across, all happy, and it's going to hit one of two type of receptors. So the first receptor is an ionotropic receptor. Let's talk about that. Ionotropic receptor. So that's just a fancy way for saying is we're going to open up a cation channel. Cation channel. So let's think for a sec, what are all the cations in our vicinity? Well, we have Ca2 plus floating around, that's where we got some from over here. We have K plus inside our cell, and we have Na plus on the outside of our cell as well. Due to driving forces, Nernst potentials, and there's another equation we can use to describe that, potassium actually has the lowest desire to move, so it's going to be completely overwhelmed by calcium and sodium, so those are going to flood into the channel and actually just continue to cause an effect down the line. We can also have a metabotropic receptor. So metabotropic receptors utilize something called a G protein sequence. G protein sequences, their whole goal is to propagate more and more signals. Really common one, let's take for example, is the IP3 DAG pathway. IP3 essentially, it gets activated by G protein, it goes through, and the IP3 goes and releases a ton of intracellular calcium, which allows the cell to do a bunch of other stuff. Point being is it's signal propagation that makes a huge effect. This is actually a good place I want to talk about a concept that sort of ties everything together. There's two types of reactions that happen here. Not reactions, but two types of relationships that exist in the metabotropic and ionotropic receptors that determine whether or not we're going to continue the action potential. Example being, let's say this guy, comes out and excites this postsynaptic neuron, but what if it's not excited enough? meaning we don't get enough to cause it to synapse, or the signal is just not worth it. The feather brushed your arm, and you felt it, and it's over, and we just need to terminate the signal. So there's two factors that will determine whether or not an ionotropic receptor is going to cause more synapses. So the first thing we consider is temporal summation. So temporal summation is actually measured in hertz, but when we say hertz, it's usually things per second. The things per second that we're measuring is stimulus from the presynaptic neuron. So how many neurotransmitters, or rather action potentials, is the presynaptic neuron getting per second, and how is that affecting our postsynaptic neuron? So in this sense, we're typically only considering one channel is how I like to think about it, because let's just say we isolate this to a single channel system. The more we get, or the more excitations we get from the presynaptic neuron per second, the more excitation, or the more likely our postsynaptic neuron is to be excited. Meaning we get more Na plus in here, more Na plus, more Na plus, and it just keeps getting more and more excited until we propagate all the way down our chain. The other type we can get is called spatial summation. So spatial summation can be thought of in two ways. The first one can be is how close are our ions together. They actually have a direct relationship. The closer the ions are, the stronger the bond, because they can sort of combine forces. The other thing to consider is how close is our ion to the axon hillock, which is the spot where the final decision is made inside a neuron. Is, hey, are we going to propagate down our axon and go to the axon terminal and become the presynaptic neuron? That decision has to be made, and it's going to be based off a factor of both spatial summation and temporal summation. These don't really exist one without the other, because think about it, the more temporal summation you have, the closer your ions are going to be, which is an increase in spatial summation, and it just kind of goes round and round.